the Rise Up See Red podcast, all about the Arizona Cardinals and the NFL, featuring insider and outsider perspectives. Enjoy the best hour of Cardinals talk on the web. Now here are your hosts, Jess Root and Seth Cox.
Hello, Arizona Cardinals fans, and welcome to the latest edition of the Rise Up See Red podcast. I'm your host, Jess Root from CardsWire.com, the USA Today NFL Wire site covering, of course, the Arizona Cardinals. And my co-host is Seth Cox from RevengeOfTheBirds.com, the SB Nation site for the Arizona Cardinals, and also the host, one of the hosts of the original Draft Breakdown podcast, as we are now on episode 379, recording on a Tuesday night, as is normally what we do. Unfortunately, the Cardinals were not able to pick up a win in Minnesota. They fall to 3-5. It's 34-26. They do a few things better offensively. They do have some struggles defensively, and they turn the ball over 3 times. But yeah, the Cardinals can't get out of their own way, can they?
No, and it's something different every week, and that's kind of what's been impressive about it. Is you want to lay it at the feet of this person or this coach or this player, whatnot. But it's been something different every week, and yes, there are some overlaps and things, but this week it's been a guy that has been a catalyst that we talked about, right? A guy that has been huge in momentum shifts for the Arizona Cardinals, and this week it went the opposite way. And man, it's just like, help yourself get out of your own way, like figure out how to sustain success, and yeah, it's just not happening, and it's a little bit surprising, I think, but it's also one of those situations where as we'll talk about later, maybe they're just not a good team, but they're just kind of average, and that's what we're seeing play out, is that they can't afford these mistakes.
Right. And in this edition of the show, we'll talk about that. We're not going to lead with the game against the Vikings. That will be actually number 2 on the show list. We'll start with the NFL trade deadline. Lots of moves made around the league. The Cardinals were not one of the teams that did that. We'll talk about what happened in the Vikings game. Good old Patrick Peterson had some interesting things to say after the game. Rodney Hudson's injury continues to linger, and then we will look ahead to their Week 9 game at home against the Seattle Seahawks, facing them for the second time in a month and for the second and final time of the regular season. So let's go ahead and get started. Let's talk about the trade deadline. Cardinals made exactly 0 moves when it came to the trade deadline. They already made their, obviously, the Cardinals have already made moves this year. So we go back to the offseason. They traded for Hollywood Brown. We go back to right before the season. They traded for Cody Ford. They traded for cornerback Trayvon Mullen. Then they traded for Robbie Anderson. So if we look at like draft capital for 2023, 2024, 2025, they traded away a 5th rounder and a 7th rounder. They got Cody Ford. They got Trayvon Mullen. Then they traded away a 6th and a 7th for 2024 and 2025 to acquire Robbie Anderson. And I mean, I'll admit that there were players that I thought the Cardinals could have and likely should have targeted because they would have made sense. And we talked about that on last week's show. But it really, for me, wasn't a surprise that the Cardinals didn't end up making any moves. And as we were mentioning kind of before the show, I cannot remember. Now, maybe someone can correct us, but I cannot remember a deadline trade that Steve Keim has ever made.
Or at least one that was of significance, like,
right.
Trading
even,
for
but even I can't think of any deadline trade. They've always addressed those like midseason needs, like when they did, like Robbie Anderson was a couple of weeks ago. They did that. They traded for Adrian Peterson. I think it was in a Week 6 game, so it was 2 weeks before the trade deadline. I can't remember a time when they made a trade within a couple of days of the deadline.
No, neither can I. And that's the thing, is deadline buyers and sellers is becoming more popular in the NFL, but it's still not something that you see as a consistent thing, right? Like it's still not a consistent occurrence in the NFL, and this was the busiest trade deadline in NFL history. So it's not surprising for the Cardinals not to jump in yet, as it's seemingly a new fad in the NFL.
Right. Now there were several moves that were made. Probably for Cardinals fans, the one of most significance was seeing Bradley Chubb get traded from Denver to Miami. Kind of a big move for Miami because Chubb is a guy, especially as a pass rusher, was a player who would have made a lot of sense for the Cardinals because he fills a significant need. He would be a significant upgrade to anyone they have on the roster right now. And yes, while you have nice young players, players that they believe in as rookies, Chubb is a significant upgrade over that. He'd already been coached by Vance Joseph, but he goes to Miami. Chase Edmonds is part of that deal, which if we know anything, so trade deadline moves, it's all about draft picks. If a player is moved, it is a deal dump, basically.
Well, the one that was really surprising, and you mentioned it, was the Chubb deal, because Denver kind of made the move, gave up or got a first round pick from Miami, and then they went and got an interesting guy in John Martin, right? I mean, he's not a Bradley Chubb level pass rusher, but like a guy that can rush the edge on a team in the New York Jets that's on the cusp of being a playoff team. And so it was kind of one, it's smart, but or Jacob Martin, sorry, I said John Martin. I apologize. Jacob Martin. And it's kind of one of those situations where it's actually, you look at it and you go, man, did the Broncos make a smart deal with this? Like,
because a guy who is going to have a big payday.
Right. So I mean, you look at it, you're talking, if you're not going to pay him, and like Jess said, you're talking probably what, 20 million a year, if not 25 million a year.
Yeah, totally.
Pass rusher on a young pass rusher on the open market. So the best you're going to get is a comp third pick. So you're talking, outside of the top 95 typically. And so instead you get a first round pick, and then you throw a kind of Hail Mary, so to speak, on a guy that's been a decent part-time pass rusher in his career, that's young, that's 27. So it's like I thought that was actually a really good job by Denver to and I'm not taking anything away from the Dolphins doing this. I think they're kind of going all in. I'm not sure I buy them as a team that should be going all in, but that's a preference thing. That's not that's a neither here nor there. But yeah, I mean, I thought Denver did a nice job of getting a first round pick plus more, and then also getting another pass rusher in a separate deal to kind of like, again, he's not on Chubb's level, but give you something. And then I was interested in your take, because we didn't text about this at all. What are the Ravens doing with the Roquan Smith deal? Like,
I don't know.
because they, I mean, a couple years ago, remember, they didn't sign and Smith's probably a little bit better of a player, but they didn't sign CJ Mosley, remember, to a big deal because they didn't want to invest in him. And so to give up a 2 for Smith, I mean, you kind of have to sign him to an extent.
You'd think so, but I mean, you always look at the Ravens. Now, granted, the Ravens, in terms of deep playoff runs, they haven't done anything in the last few years, but they seem to they always seem to be on the right
In
end
the
of
mix,
draft.
yeah.
They always seem to be on the right end of trades in the draft. So perhaps, this is
And
this
maybe I'm under.
Ray Lewis,
Yeah.
that Roquan, a guy that he's an incredible talent. They see as potentially a dude who could be their anchor in their defense moving forward for years.
And maybe I'm underselling CJ Mosley. I didn't realize he was a 4-time second team All Pro player. So
he's Mosley's an interesting guy because when you watch, you look at his volume numbers and you're very impressed, and then you watch him on the field and you're not as impressed.
Right.
And
other
than the presence, but
yeah.
there became, over the last few years, there's been some health issues that have been for him and durability that kind of saps him of his effectiveness.
And so those were kind of the quote unquote big trades, right? Like the big name that went. But I thought, let me ask you this: would you have given up what the Dolphins gave up for Chubb?
Maybe.
The reason it makes it hard because you're giving up. Okay, so the equivalence would be, I guess. I mean, I don't know if they would have done this, but it would have been James Conner because he and Chase Edmond are about paid the same, right?
Yeah, but I sort of throw the. Yeah, I will have to kind of look at the deal differently, because the way I looked at the kind of the DeAndre Hopkins deal, I basically looked at it as two trades to make it make more sense. Right. And anytime and basically what Miami was doing was saying we got it wrong with Chase. It's a contract dump, because then they immediately traded for Jeff Wilson.
Right. And so you look at it, and again, you're accurate in that, and it's hard to compare apples to apples on that. Maybe it's I don't even know what to compare it to. I wouldn't know who the player that you would throw in there, but it's basically a first and a fourth for Chubb, and so that makes it tough. It was interesting to see the Bears give up a second round pick for Chase Claypool, I thought, because while the Cardinals gave up a first for Marquise Brown, I feel like Brown's a much better player than Claypool.
Yeah. Right. And we've seen that is that Claypool, there was a lot of hype, especially in the rookie year. He's never quite put it all together. Hollywood is that 1,000-yard year, and then through the first few weeks, he looked like a legit number one. He looked like a legit number one in the league.
And then, I'm just going through the list of trades. So, like you said, you had the Robbie Anderson deal, which kind of kicked it off. Christian McCaffrey to the 49ers. James Robinson goes to the Jets after Breece Hall gets injured. Jonathan Hankins ends up in Dallas for basically peanuts. Robert Quinn, we talked about a little bit, 4th rounder. Kadarius Toney ends up in Kansas City for a 3rd and a 6th. I thought that was a really interesting deal. Obviously the Giants admitting they got it wrong, but giving up a 3rd for Toney feels rich at this point. But I guess if anybody's going to get something of them, it's going to be the Chiefs, right?
You'd figure, but they also took a shot on DeAndre Baker, former first-round corner from about the Giants, and he didn't do anything when he went to KC either. So
yeah, and then you got, like we said, Smith, and I was really intrigued by this because the Ravens gave up a 2nd and a 5th, and again that the Bears do that because now they don't have to sign a linebacker to a big deal, and then 2, you don't have to worry about only getting a 3rd round compensation. But the one that was really intriguing to me was the Lions sending TJ Hawkinson.
Yeah, that made why did you send him in the division?
In the division but they got a 2nd and a 3rd. So do you think that's basically just saying, hey, we couldn't afford to re-sign him, we're just going to take what we can get for him?
It's got to be, honestly. It's got to be. Like we look across the league, William Jackson gets traded for a low pick from Washington.
Everything else was really just kind of. I
But
mean,
like you look at the moves, the moves. If you're looking at the stuff that happened, the only one that I think in terms of the Cardinals that would have made sense, the only one was Bradley Chubb. You know, the cornerbacks. I don't think, especially with what we've seen with how the Cardinals they take their time on making sure that they know that it takes about 3 weeks for them to even consider putting them out on the field. William Jackson hadn't really shown much this year. The cornerbacks that got moved, you're like, eh. So there wasn't like, it's not like the Cardinals were going to go out and get Roquan Smith. They weren't going to go out and going to get Chase Edmonds. They weren't going to get Jeff Wilson. Those moves were meaningless. As we talked about last week, the only deals that really made sense would be to make a deal for a significant impact pass rusher. Bradley Chubb would qualify for that, or let's say Robert Quinn, even though he hadn't done much this year, but he ends up going to the Eagles, and then a defensive tackle. And there were no real proven defensive tackles that really did much. You got Jonathan Hankins going to the Cowboys, but outside of that, the defensive line stuff, there was no movement. So in terms of what the Cardinals were going to do, it's not like they didn't need to do anything on offense, really. You might argue that they could have looked at their center position, but they anticipate Hudson coming back soon. And so they've been in a waiting pattern, just trying to piecemeal it. So it's not like going out and trading for another center would have made sense, nor was any decent center available from what we can tell, right?
Right. And that's the other thing. I think the only intriguing ones, and that's just because I'm always advocate throwing stuff at the wall, were trading for William Jackson for a 6th rounder, or Rashad Fenton for a conditional 7th rounder. Those are the only ones that really like are intriguing to me, outside of, like you said, the Chubb one, because you're not trading for TJ Hawkinson. Obviously, you just drafted Trey McBride
and you signed Zach Ertz for 3 years. So
right, and so like these other deals, like you said, the Robert Quinn, we talked about that last week. I don't know if you bring in a veteran, situational pass rusher,
right? Especially while he still could be productive, he's also at the age when the Cardinals said no, go buy Calais, by Chandler Jones. He's at that age. And like right. Marcus Golden, they signed him to a 1-year extension, considering he's now in his 30s. So I get all of that. And yeah, it totally makes sense. But we also have to realize this as well. Day 3 picks over the next 3 years, the Cardinals have burned up a lot of those already. They already gave up a 5th and a 7th for this coming year. They gave up a 6th for 1 year and a 7th and another year for the year after. And so the Cardinals honestly aren't rolling with a whole lot of draft capital in terms of day 3 type things of these. Fans want to see the team do things. And here's the message. Here's the message, I think, when you don't make a move like this. So you don't go out and make a trade move. You're saying it's kind of one of 3 things. 1, you believe the talent on your roster is sufficient to accomplish the goals that you have for whatever reason. So and the way they treated this offseason was you kind of got that vibe. The Cardinals were kind of doing that. The second one is you're just saying, there isn't anyone out there significant enough to improve things. You could also be saying the cost to acquire an improvement isn't worth it either. And so now the question is, do we agree? Was there a move that they should have made? I don't know. They're not getting enough production from the edge, and they are woefully thin on the defensive interior in terms of impact outside of Zach Allen and JJ Watt. So you kind of feel like they should have, but very few players that were out there available were probably going to have enough of an impact over the next several weeks, which is, let's be honest, this 3-game stretch entering their 3 straight games against the NFC West probably make or break their season.
Yeah, and it's going to be, like you said, a make or break time for them. And it's always tough when trades don't get made to be able to stand up and be like, oh, why didn't you do this or this or this? But like you said, outside of Chubb, I don't know where there was an instant improvement, right? Like that made them better immediately. And so that's the biggest thing, is like how, people can say, oh, well, why didn't you go trade for a run stuffer or this or that or the other things? Like, why didn't you do this? And it's like, the other thing is, guys have to be available. So like, you can only look at the guys that were trading and say, could you have made a move for that? Because I saw people being like, why didn't they go after Matt Ioannidis or Daron Payne, like we talked about from Washington last week? And it's like, well, did they get traded? So the reality is they may not have been available. Like,
right.
You can call and ask, but like, it doesn't mean that they're available. And that's kind of
or they're available to more than you're willing to give up ultimately.
Right, exactly. So, it's just one of those situations. Yeah, less than ideal, but that they don't do anything on a team that's 3-5 at this juncture. But at the same time, it's like we talked about at the beginning, they've had the opportunity to make plays and do things, and they just haven't. So that, all of those things can come together to make this a better situation.
Coming up next on the Rise Up Sea Red podcast, best of Cardinals talk on the web. Let's return and talk about the Cardinals game on Sunday. Our biggest takeaways from that the loss to the Vikings. That's coming up next on Rise Up Sea Red. We're back on the Rise Up Sea Red podcast, the best of Cardinals talk on the web. The Cardinals lose on Sunday on the road, 34-26 to the Minnesota Vikings. It was a lot of the same problems. They gave up an early touchdown. They didn't score a touchdown in the first quarter. They turned the ball over multiple times. They had mistakes when they badly did not need to make mistakes, whether it was the interceptions, whether it was Billy Price snapping the football in the red zone when Kyler wasn't ready for it, whether it was Trey McBride getting consecutive holding penalties. And so let's talk about that. What were as we look at that loss, what were let's say your 3 biggest takeaways from the loss in that game?
I think the first thing is that they're close. They just continue to shoot themselves in the foot. And it's just a different, like we talked about in the open, like it's just a different way of losing every week. And that's what makes it kind of frustrating more than anything else, is that, you take a 17-14 lead and then you give it right back and you're down 28-17. And then all of a sudden, like, you just can't claw your way back in. And, you go back and look, they take that lead at 17-14 after being down 14-3. And it's easy for the Vikings, right? And that's what we talked about the other week. They tie that game with the Eagles, and what happens? The Eagles go on a 900 play 9-minute drive. And
exactly.
And it's like, the defense played well enough to get them in a position to take a 17-14 lead, but like, why can you not follow it up the next series? And that's just what happens. And you look at it,
Well, and we thought they'd turned the corner against the Saints because they had those game-changing plays. The defense did not have game-changing plays this time. Except
right.
they got you have the Isaiah Simmons play where he has the strip sack, and you thought that was going to be some momentum, and it wasn't.
Right. And so it's just, it comes back to, they need to be able to sustain success. 2, they have to when something goes bad. So for instance, you look at it, they get down 21-17. All right. So less than ideal, right? to go from taking a lead to within 4 minutes of game or less than 4 minutes of game time. Now they're trailing again. You can't come out and make a mistake like Kyler Murray did, right? And he threw an interception that was just ill-advised and just, and that's again a bad team trying to do too much. But now it's 28-17. They're trailing, by 9 or sorry, 11. And so you go, okay, well, we'll see what happens here. And then they go down. And remember, so now the Cardinals took the lead with 9:01 left in the game. 9:01. And at 4:07 left in the game, so less than 5 minutes of game time, they're now down 28-17. And then with 2:37 left in the third quarter, they cut it back to 28-13. And it's like, okay, this is a team that is in a position to have a chance to win the game. And then the defense comes out and goes 3 and out. And you're like, oh, okay. And so that ends the third quarter, right? And they get the ball back. They go down. You talked about it. A bad snap by Billy Price. Really inopportune time, right? Like to take a bad snap, especially coming out of a timeout. But they kick the field goal. Everything's hunky-dory, 28-26. And then what happens? The defense again comes out and gives up a touchdown drive. And it's like, wait a second. You guys have these back-to-back, positive, and then you come out and you can't put it together one more time. And it's simple stuff like that you look at and you go, where is the consistency for this team? Where's this team's ability to, sustain success and then not have to like figure it out? And it's just, I just don't see it consistently. And I don't know if that's coaching. Like I legitimately don't know what to blame it on, but there's something missing. There's an ingredient that's missing every game that makes it really difficult because they can't get out of their own way.
Right. And I want to go to a different place for my biggest takeaway, and it is just what the heck, DeAndre Hopkins. DeAndre Hopkins already in two games, he's now on pace. So he's missed the first 6 games of the season. I'd like to say I don't think he can keep up this pace. But with how the Cardinals offensively are going, he might be able to keep up this pace. He's on pace for over 100 catches for over 1,400 yards, and he missed the first 2 games of the season. Now, we already talked about the fact that Hopkins is an extremely motivated player right now to come out. I think he's eyeing 1,000 yards in 11 games, and the way things look right now, if he stays healthy, you can definitely tell that having Hopkins on the field makes a huge difference. And Kyler Murray just trust him. He will find ways to get him the ball.
Yeah, and they need to continue to do that. And I mean, we say that, but how much more can you really force him the ball, right? He's, like you said, in 2 games, he's just playing at an insanely high level. And to come back after his 10-catch, 103-yard performance, to come back with 12 for 159 and a touchdown, it's just like, man, they're getting right there. And that's the thing, is like, as dumb as it sounds, they're really close on offense. It's just there's 1 or 2 things every game that they shoot themselves in the foot with, and that's what it really comes down to when you look at it. Whether it's a mistake by Kyler on one of the interceptions, a mistake by Zach on the other interception, the offensive line's inability to and I get that they're down, 3 guys on one side, and Cody Ford's doing okay, but um
It's the
or
inconsistency with the center position is honestly is the issue, because in 4 games without Rodney Hudson, you had a good game from Sean Harlow, and then a bad game. And then you had a good game from Billy Price last week, and then a bad game from Billy Price. And so they're not getting, so even without Hudson, they're not getting a consistent level of performance from that variance is causing problems.
Well, and you look at it, and and I think this is one of the takeaways you can have to that is like, look at the stats in this game. And I know, gross stats don't tell the whole story, but this is one that is pretty telling to me. And it's, you look at the rushing totals, and you have 111 yards from Dalvin Cook. Then number 2, you have 40 yards from Alexander Madison. Number 3 is Kyler Murray with 36 yards rushing. And then number 4 is Kirk Cousins. And so the top 4 rushers, your quarterback leads the way with less than 40 yards rushing. So for a team that wants to be balanced, they had no balance in this game. And that shows in the, this situation where you look at just the yards from scrimmage, right? Something as simple as yards from scrimmage, where you're like, well, that's just a stat, whatever. But it's like,
you can't score touchdowns without gaining yards.
Right. And so if you're having to throw the ball to get, so basically they had 400 yards of offense. And the Vikings had 400 yards of offense, but they had 173 rushing yards and 3 rushing touchdowns. Like, that makes a huge difference. And we talked about it. I mean, at the end of the day, the biggest thing is the turnovers, right? Like, you can't have 3 turnovers in a game,
right,
and expect to win. Because in every other way you look at it, it was an equal or even game, but the rushing yards and the turnover battle, that's what kind of put it in the favor of the Vikings. And you can kind of connect those two with the inconsistency of the offensive line, right? Like, the inability to run the ball, having to throw the ball so much, you're going to have a higher variance and likely, see mistakes. And Murray, like I said, Murray made an ill-advised throw in the deep one, but then Ertz runs the wrong route, and that's 2 turnovers, whereas your team made a play, like you said, Isaiah Simmons makes a great play, rushing the passer, strip sack that they recover, and that's what you expect. Like, you can give the Vikings credit on the first Murray interception. They hit his arm as he's trying to throw it. He can't get everything on the throw. He can't step up in the pocket because they brought the house and won. But I mean, realistically, the Cardinals had 2 really bad unforced errors in this game, and we haven't even talked about the second one, and that's the Greg Dortch muff punt.
Oh geez, you can't have that at all. Definitely
And
not.
that's just what I meant earlier by this isn't, that's good teams can overcome that, average or below average, and I'm not sure if they're a below average team yet, but like, below average or average teams can't overcome that. You can't, if you're an average team, you can't beat a good team if you turn the ball over 3 times.
Right. Yeah. And I don't know what the solution is, why they keep making mistakes consistently over and over and over and over and over and over again. But yeah, the other thing about this game that kind of stood out to me was, if you have turnovers, you've got to make it up in other ways. Like, if you turn the ball over, but the Cardinals then struggled to do things that defensively that they've been doing well, which is slowing opponents. They're holding against the running game. So not Dalvin Cook ended this first one who's gone over 100 yards against them, and top receivers had not been beating them. And that changed this week. So they gave the ball away and defensively they weren't able to maintain things, and Minnesota was 6 for 13 on third down. And so it was kind of a number of things, and they kept getting, they had 10 penalties. So granted, both teams were penalized 10 times, but like, if you're going to turn the ball over, you've got to basically be flawless in the other things.
Yeah, you do. And that's the thing, is like, they weren't. And that's what I said. It was just one of those games where, and I think that's what's so frustrating to me, is that there were so many mistakes at so many levels. They couldn't stop the run. They couldn't run the football. They had 3 turnovers. They didn't. I mean, they caused the 1 turnover, and yet they had a chance. And that, to me, is what's irritating about the situation, right? Like, you've got all of these situations, and yet somehow you're there at the end.
Yeah, and that's
and it's just, I think that's what the most frustrating thing is.
And their inability to start games well. The fact was, so in 8 games this season, they have allowed a first drive touchdown. Most in the NFL, they have not scored a touchdown in the first quarter. So every single game, they are getting behind. So they're never able, like, now a couple of the games they haven't been far behind. For example, when they got behind 7-3, they made a game changing play against the Saints with Antonio Hamilton picking them off in the end zone. But they, for some reason, are unable to make plays early. They are resilient, and so it is something that you have to admire in the team, is that they're battling. So they're not giving up. They are battling, they're trying, and they get back into games and even put themselves in positions to be ahead, but they just make too many mistakes. And part of the fact is they don't have room for error because they keep falling behind. You can't start games like that. You can't give up a touchdown every single time that you're on the field for the first time defensively, and then you can't go without scoring a touchdown in every first quarter. That just it's a recipe for failure.
And that's why they're failing. I mean, that's legitimately the only thing you can say about it, right? That they are failing because they're putting themselves in a spot to fail consistently.
Right.
And so you're having to play desperate. You're having to play a little careless in order to make comebacks. And sometimes it works. And this year it hasn't. And so how do you overcome that? And what do you do? Well, you have to be able to start more consistently and play from ahead at least once, right?
Yeah, it'd be nice to see. Coming up next on the Rise Up Secret podcast, the best of Cardinals talk on the web. This isn't even related to Cardinals, except it's something maybe that happened a couple years ago. Patrick Peterson, what did he have to say after playing the Cardinals last weekend? And do we believe him? That's coming up next on Rise Up Secret. We're back on the Rise Up Secret podcast, the best of Cardinals talk on the web. One of the things that came out of that game was a very chippy and chirpy Patrick Peterson. Made a few plays of the game. He himself had predicted he would get 2 interceptions against the Cardinals. He did not get any interceptions. The Vikings did get 2 interceptions. He himself did not line up against DeAndre Hopkins once. He made a nice play in the end zone, breaking up a pass that would have been a touchdown to A.J. Green. Made a couple of nice breakups on other guys, but then we also saw him miss a tackle, and Rondale Moore went for a touchdown there. However, the story is that he was clearly fired up for this game, which is interesting because this is not the first time that he's played the Cardinals. He played them last year, week 2. He came back to State Farm Stadium. But after the game, he was fired up. And we know, so he talked about how he's still waiting for a call from Steve Keim. And then he also revealed in post-game comments how emails to the owner were put on his chair in his locker, saying that, it's a fan saying he wasn't going to renew his tickets if Patrick is at the team because he's washed up, he's slow, he can't tackle. That seemed like a weird thing. He made it sound like it was Michael Bidwill doing it because there were emails to the owner, and then he said someone put it in his locker. So I personally wonder about that. But let's get your takeaway from that. What did you take away? Was there anything, any reaction to what Pat said after the game about Keim, about those emails or the chip apparently that he had on his shoulder playing the Cardinals now, not for the first time, for the second time?
No, I think it just is one of those things that sometimes these guys in general want to create this idea in their head or create this idea that this is what, to motivate themselves or put themselves in a position where they feel like they're being, what's the word I'm looking for, overlooked, or whatever, however you want
They're
to
being
look at
disrespected. It's basically creating a chip on their shoulder to be motivated.
Right, and that's what Patrick was doing, and that's just who he is, and there's nothing wrong with that. I mean, good for him, and at the end of the day, he's having success after basically becoming a guy that couldn't do anything. And there's nothing wrong with that. And I mean, I'm glad he's having success somewhere else. Obviously, he feels like he was jilted and he's coming across as a kind of crazy ex-girlfriend that's like,
yeah, that's a good way to describe it.
Look
what he
what
had
I
to say
have
about
here.
Keim. We knew that. So there's one thing. If I find it interesting, the whole email thing, because he's had so many opportunities to address this if he wanted to bring it up, because he has a podcast. He talked about free agency when he left the Cardinals and signed with the Vikings. He talked about that. He talked about, and we knew. So when he was talking about, he's still waiting for Steve Keim to call him. Now, I will say this. I don't know if Steve Keim technically can call Patrick Peterson anymore. I think that might be tampering.
Yeah, I mean, semantics don't matter to Patrick.
I mean, that's here's the, I'm still waiting. Steve Keim, I'm still waiting for your phone call. He gets, let's wait. He can't do that now. That's impropriety. That's tampering. That's an impropriety in the league. Now, that said, we discussed the whole free agency thing, how Patrick was, that Keim literally never said anything to him. And right or wrong, he had no obligation to do that. But we've always questioned, like, Steve Keim has had an interesting way of handling players on their way out. And so that's a beef I totally understand. We understand that that's on brand for Steve Keim. The other thing, I don't know what to think about this, because he's never brought it up before. And he didn't really give any specificity to when this happened. So he said in his final years with the team, we don't know if that qualifies under Cliff Kingsbury years or the Steve Wilkes year in 2018, that these emails were left for him to read. And I can think of a couple of things. If it was printed out and given to him in his locker room, in his locker at his chair, it was purposeful, and it wasn't by accident, and it wasn't necessarily sinister. It might have simply been a coaching tactic. Now, how many times do coaches play the card, prove them wrong?
Yeah, and that's the thing is, I don't know what there is to it other than I feel like Patrick became really sensitive at the end, man.
Well, look at the timeline. So he went from when Steve Wilkes was hired and they're implementing this new defense in the offseason, he praises how much, like, instead of, because he'd been, he gets cat covered, so he covers that guy. He praised the new system because it will allow him to do different things and use different skills, only to then later that season be upset with his usage and request a trade.
Yeah, demand a trade.
He requested a trade and did not like the usage, even though he publicly supported that. Then he gets suspended. And on top of that, not only does he get suspended, Then he has a tiff with the front office because
he goes after the front office.
Yeah, he goes after the front office because they wouldn't redo his deal so he wouldn't be, essentially his suspension wouldn't cost him as much money. They wanted to redo his deal, so he got a signing bonus then. That way it was less. Now we've seen that, that happened with Tom Brady. The Sean Watson's contract was kind of structured like that as well. So he had a tiff like that, and he was upset with the organization. He got suspended for the 6 games. Not only is a suspension for 6 games, this is not a DeAndre Hopkins suspension. This was back in 2019 when a 6-game suspension meant you got caught, and you got caught trying to cover it up. So it wasn't a case where, whoops, it was, I'm doing this and I'm going to try to cover it up. Hopkins with his trace amounts. And so then he comes back from that, plays inconsistently. 2020, he has some good, he has some bad. He even talked about, and it never felt like, from what he said, that he had a bad relationship with Michael Bidwill, because he talked about how he has talked about since he left, how he believes he'll be back to be placed in the Ring of Honor. It felt like that he and the owner have been on the same page. So I would have a hard time believing that was something that Bidwill would do underhandedly, like sneak it into the locker room to kind of motivate him. Like maybe it was a Steve Wilkes thing, Al Holcomb thing. But at the same time, it doesn't feel like that is on brand for any of the main leadership and the coaching staff, unless it were purposely done. Because the ones that'd be interesting, because if it's supposedly to Bidwill, so Bidwill gave that to coaches, who then gave that to Pat to see whether that was a Wilkes thing or what. That feels off brand for Kingsbury staff.
I was gonna say that just seems so far-fetched.
So whatever. Anyway, but ultimately he gets the last word in, because the Vikings won. He played well, even if he didn't get used with DeAndre Hopkins, which we all kind of wanted to see if he would, but they didn't. They had Cameron Dantzler on then. But yeah, coming up next on the Rise of Sea-Red podcast, Star of Cardinals Talk of the Web. Let's move on and talk a little bit about Rodney Hudson. It's an interesting situation. He continues to be injured. That's coming up next on Rise of Sea-Red. We're back on the Rise of Sea-Red podcast, Star of Cardinals Talk on the Web. Rodney Hudson has missed the last 4 games with the knee injury. We know entering the season, there was some question about whether he wanted to come back. They managed his knee through the preseason. He gets through the first 4 games. Then the last 4 he's out. He's going to be out this week. And so we're looking at a 5-game stretch, at least maybe 6 games, where he is unavailable. And he was like the one guy on the offensive line entering the season that they really couldn't afford to lose, was it?
Yeah, I mean, they thought they were going to be able to bring along the Cetus Smith slowly, and obviously that never happened. And now you're at the situation where they're throwing stuff at the wall. Sean Harlow, like you said, had a decent game and then came back and was legitimately awful. And now then they bring in Billy Price. And so it's just been tough, man. And like, yeah, this guy in Hudson that was supposed to be kind of the anchor to the offensive line, and last year when he played was really good. Now all of a sudden he's not even here, and they have no options or answers at the center position, and it's just, I don't know. It's just unfortunate, and I don't know what the answer is. If I'm being completely honest,
I don't want to. Like, there's a lot of talk among fans about he doesn't want to play, and he's just trying to take his money. I legitimately believe that part of the reason why he balked at coming back to play was because of his health, was because of his body, and after a lot of convincing from the team, he decided to give it a go. And so they tried to manage, because it sounds like, since it's the knee, they've talked about the knee was the issue all through training camp. And so they knew they had a resident. And I believe that's been the problem the entire time. Said he got to a place and said, all right, I'm going to play. And they had a plan for him. And maybe that was the reason why he said he would come back, because they had a plan for him to kind of work him through and get him ready for the season. The problem is the knee continues to be a problem. And from everything we know about Rodney Hudson, we have no reason to believe that he is purposely just, he's sandbagging everyone.
No,
he would play if he could play. The problem is that the Cardinals were desperate at center because they acquired him the year before. They planned on they counted on him being the center at least for 2 seasons, and so they didn't really have anything in a backup plan. They didn't target anyone in free agency.
We do know
Tyler Linderbaum would have been their pick in the first round had they not traded the pick to get Hollywood, and they wanted Cam Jurgens in the second round.
Cam Jurgens in the second round. So you have, they were going to address the future position, but it never came to fruition, and now it's kind of the worst case scenario.
Now the question is, people's like, well, why didn't put him on injured reserve? I get that. He hasn't missed 4 games, so you could be giving a roster spot. I have no problem with how they've been doing this. One, you have to manage who you put on injured reserve because you're only allowed to designate 8 players to return. That's not activate. It means designate. So Antoine Wesley's already burned one of those 8. 2,
and then he got injured again.
Yeah, that's the downside. And so they've got players that they still want to bring back. You got Chuck Washington that they want to bring back. You've got Hollywood Brown they want to bring back. And they already used a few of them. That said, this is not something that's new. They didn't know that it was going to be a 5-6 week injury. This is a chronic thing that they just haven't been able to get right. And so they've had to they've had to drag this out because they didn't know how long it would be. Now, if we think back to the days even when you had to miss 8 weeks, or even before that, anyone who was going into reserve, done for the year, you have to have players inactive anyway. And so if it's a key player and there is any doubt, if there's any uncertainty or the possibility you can come back before the 4 games and not have to burn one of your designations, it makes sense to keep him available. Kind of like with Matt Prater, that we do. There are certain you can do that because you have to have players inactive anyway. And so I don't have a problem with how they manage the roster. It's just unfortunately that he's not back yet. And it's one of the I'm going to call this is one of the unfortunate, unlucky things that has happened with the Cardinals this season.
Yeah, and it's just one of those things that you can't, like you said, you can't control it, and it just happened, and you kind of move on and wait for him to come back. Because, like you said, they don't have a better option. Billy Price had a nice first game, but there's a reason that he's
Billy Price still.
Right, that he's on
Sean Cooler didn't
team.
fix him.
Right. And so, Hudson's unfortunately still your best option, and you've got to do something with that.
Coming up next on the Rise Up C-Red podcast, Mr. Cardinals Talk on the Web. Let's move on and wrap up the show by talking about their next game coming up against the Seattle Seahawks. That's coming up next on Rise Up C-Red. We're back on the Rise Up C-Red podcast, the best Cardinals Talk on the Web, as we continue with our show talking about the Cardinals next week, week 9, this weekend. Week 9 battle against the Seattle Seahawks. It is they've played 2 games in a row against conference opponents, and this is the first of 3 consecutive games in the NFC West. They're already 0-2 in the division. They've already lost to Seattle once this season. Now they play this. Yeah. And with the loss, we said last week, you kind of have to go 3-1 in this 4-game stretch. Guess what? They've lost 1 game. They basically, it's almost to the point where they have to win these next 3 games. It's not absolutely, but they can't afford to lose to the Seahawks this weekend because they're already 2 games behind. If they lose again, they'll be 3 games behind the Seahawks and essentially 4 games behind the Seahawks because the Seahawks will also have the head-to-head sweep. And so the tiebreaker, they will be, for all intents and purposes, 4 games behind the Seahawks if they lose this weekend, and they will be 0-3 in the division, which means really, if we're going to consider them a playoff team, they would have to win the rest of their games. I'm not gonna be go. I'm not gonna. This is not a crazy thought. They have to win the next 2 games. They have to beat the Seahawks. They have to beat the Rams, but they can't afford to lose a head-to-head tiebreaker to either one of them. The 49ers, they will be wrapped up with the division with the Seahawks and the Rams before they even play the 49ers. So technically, as long as they win one of those 2 games against the 49ers, I think they still keep themselves in contention. But if they lose against Seattle, it's going to be very, very difficult to overcome them. Now, granted, there's still a lot of season left, and it's not like at 5-3 being in first place. There's a 2-game gap between first and last place in the division. But that said, you put yourself 3 games behind the Seahawks, guarantee they're going to be in first place in another week, and basically be 4 games back in terms of ties and everything. You've basically sunk your season in terms of the division. And when you're going for the wild card, good luck, because the NFC East has teams winning. You've got the Eagles, you've got the Cowboys, you've got the Giants, all winning games.
Yeah, and even the Commanders are technically ahead of the Cardinals right now. So it's just, I mean, it's a big game in the sense of like you said, staying competitive within the division and not feeling like the season's over at this point. And that's one of the things that we talk about quite often, right? Is like, we don't want to see this season as over in week 9.
Right.
And quite frankly, like you said, it's really tough to see it not being over if they do lose this week to the Seahawks. And like you said at the beginning of the show, I mean, they basically helped the Seahawks defense get healthy, right? And
this is crazy. This is a Seahawks team that entering week 6 was terrible. That's one thing I want to bring up, is that the Seahawks have suddenly gone from an awful defensive team to a very solid defensive team. If we recall, the Seahawks were dead last in yards allowed and second to last in points allowed. And since then, they've won 3. So the Cardinals game started a 3-game stretch of good defense. So here are the numbers. Now, I'm going to ignore the first game because that motivates. From weeks 2 through 5, they were giving up 34.5 points a game and 430 yards per game. That was over 4 weeks. They gave up no fewer than 27 points from weeks 2 through 5. Then they turned it around with a 19-9 win over the Cardinals, where the Cardinals couldn't get in the end zone. But their defensive play continued over the last 3 weeks. They're 3 wins in a row. So they've got wins. They've got wins over the Cardinals, the Chargers, and the Giants. The Cardinals, you can argue whether they're a good team or not. The Chargers are a talented team that's decimated by injuries, and the Giants as well. The Giants have been rolling. But in their last 3 games, they've allowed 15 points a game and only 290 yards in terms of. So they have improved. They have cut the points. That's a 19-point improvement in points allowed, and basically 140 yards better per game. This is now a kind of complete Seahawks team, because Geno Smith is still playing at a high level. Ken Walker is running the ball very well. And now the defense is coming together. And suddenly the Seahawks team that we all thought was going to be terrible to just above bad, not quite good, but not good and not bad enough to, I figured they would be a 5 or 6 win team. They've already got 5 wins, and they're playing like the most complete team in the division right now.
Yeah, and it's really interesting to see what they've brought all of a sudden as an offense with Geno Smith and Kenneth Walker. Obviously, they've had that dynamic duo at wide receiver, and the fact that Metcalf somehow is still healthy is insane, right? After he went down. But you look at it, this team has become a team that understands how to how to keep themselves in games and put themselves in a position to win games. And they've done it against all types of teams, which is what's making it impressive. And I think we sometimes just forget how good of a coach Pete Carroll was for so long, right?
Well, and that the part of that is because we thought that the game had passed him up, right?
Yeah, and it's just one of those situations where now you're watching them, they're playing well, they're a team that's consistently improving every week and getting better. Um, you know, they played, I thought they played really well against the Giants this week, and I was surprised to see how easily they handled the Giants.
Right.
That who was playing well before that. And so when you look at it from that perspective, you look at it and you go, man, this could be a tough game. And so you're looking at it from two different perspectives. Is the Cardinals are a desperate team that have to win, while the Seahawks are playing, either above their head, or that they're just, like you said, that good of a team, and you're just waiting to see how they, if they are able to maintain and sustain that through an entire 17 game season. And so, I'm not going to say it's make or break for Seattle if they lose this game, but it is going to be one of those situations where you look at it and you go, okay, are they for real, or is this a team that has gotten fat on a lot of getting guys or getting teams in the right weekends in the right situations, and are playing above the out over their skis a little bit. And I'll be interested to see how this goes, because I think the Cardinals will have to play with a little more desperation than what we've seen. And like you said, that's going to have to start at the beginning of the game if they want to have a chance.
We felt like that had DeAndre Hopkins played in that game in Seattle, the Cardinals probably could have won that game because they were just missing a little something offensively. They've got to protect the football this week. The Seahawks have, so it's very interesting. They have had exactly 2 takeaways in every game but week 2. So they have managed to force takeaways multiple times in 7 of their 8 games. We know that the Cardinals are not good enough to overcome. They haven't been able to play thus far where they play mistake enough. They make fewer mistakes to overcome turnovers.
Yeah, and that's literally what it's going to have to be now. They're going to have to play a little, I don't want to say mistake free, but they're going to have to play better than they have, and play at a more consistent rate. But I don't know if that corresponds well with the fact that they probably are going to be playing desperate, right?
You'd think so. They bottled up Kenneth Walker some, but he made 2 or 3. I think there were 2 big runs that he did against them, maybe 3. And then they were great against Tyler Lockett and DK Metcalf. They combined for 4 catches for 51 yards in that week 6 game. Now, the problem is the Cardinals have now given up in 2 straight weeks. They have allowed a receiver to go over 95 yards individually. Chris Olave went for over 100, and then Justin Jefferson went for 6 for 98, I think it was. And so their ability, like what they were doing to kind of take away a top receiver has waned some for whatever reason, whether it's just the defense wasn't sustainable for that sort of success without the offensive help, or whatever reason. But they're gonna have to make Geno Smith make mistakes. Interesting fact: Geno Smith has never thrown a touchdown pass against the Cardinals, but he hasn't played him much, but still has not thrown a touchdown pass against the Cardinals, and keeping that trend up would be a step in the right direction for Arizona.
And it is something they need to do this week. It'll be interesting too to see if they're playing better at home, or if that was a one-off, right? If they've fixed their home remedies and now there's a road issue. But that's another conversation for after the game, right? To see
Right.
where they're at. But it's a game where I hope to see them play at a more controlled but frenetic pace, if that makes sense. I'd like to see them play at a level where, they understand that they're kind of in a backs against the wall situation, and they need to start playing like it. Because it was fine 2 weeks ago, but now all of a sudden that you're 3-5 and you're, basically at the halfway point of the season, you need to start turning it on, because like you said, the NFC East and even the NFC West are, you can't fall too far behind, or like we said, week 9 ending your season, that's some old Cardinal stuff.
Right. And even even at 3, it's not like the season is, but they're going to be, even if they got hot after that, they're in a position where they will be they'll be behind schedule. They just be like, even if they did everything, they might be they will just be in contention, or like you start putting the playoff picture things together. You've got who's in and who's in the mix. They would only be in the mix and never really contending. But an interesting thing for here is that if we know something about the Cardinals, about this team, this team has been competitive. So they've been tough, they have battled, and so we haven't seen them give up. The bad game they had against Kansas City was execution. They never stopped trying. And so we haven't seen them give up on things. We've just seen them just play not well enough. I think what we're going to see, even though like the matchups at this point, Seattle's playing well, the Cardinals are not playing well enough. So you think Seattle's going to win, right? But I think the Cardinals play better. Like that desperation finally does sit in, and I think that they will pull this game out. This isn't just like, yeah, the Cardinals going to. I'm still believe in them. It's like I think they're at the point where we see teams around the NFL. That's when they have these wins happen, and if they do win, they have to sustain that. So it can't be the desperate one game. They have to maintain that desperation now between now and the end of the season.
Yeah, and that's what you want to see in the growth in that situation. And I don't know if I can pick them to win anymore just because they've let me down so much. But they, like you said, this is a situation where they have to come out and play at a high level, or it's going to kind of signify the end of their season in what can only be looked at as a lost season overall.
Yeah, it would be that. Jeez. I wrote the preview for this game for Sports Weekly, which I think hits convenience stores, grocery stores Wednesday. And I have the Cardinals pulling out a 23-20 win. We know that Cardinals-Seahawks games are never normal. And so we'll just have to see how that plays out. Who steps up? We're getting production from DeAndre Hopkins and Rondale Moore. Who's going to be that other guy? Is it going to be Robbie Anderson? Is it going to be Eno with another big game? Does James Conner come back? Those are the questions. We need one or two more players being productive offensively to kind of remedy things, and we need plays on defense. They got to take the ball away. But Geno Smith's having a fantastic season. It's continuing, and it's one of the more feel like outside. If you're not a Cardinals fan, that's a really good story.
Right, and you want it to continue to be a good story after this week.
Yep, yes, we can have that. So, do you think? Are you going to make a prediction for this game?
If I had to make a prediction, I'd probably pick Seattle to win this game. I just don't know what to think of this team right now, and if they can put it all together and have a game where they come out and don't make those costly errors. And so we'll see how that turns out. I hope I'm wrong. So that's all I can say.
All right. And with that, we will wrap up this edition of the Rise of Syria podcast. Mr. Cardinals talking about this episode 379. We'll be back again next week after the Cardinals play the Seahawks. They'll be lining up to play the Rams, and we'll see how that goes, because I think they'll win, but I don't know. Like I don't have confidence. My reason for picking the Cardinals is not because I believe they'll win. It's because I think that's just how it will go because they're in that situation, if that makes any sense at all. But that's Seth Cox. I'm Jess Root. This is Rise Up Sea Red Podcast. We'll be back again next week. Thanks for listening as always.
Thanks for listening to the latest edition of the Rise Up Sea Red Podcast. Listen to previous episodes and subscribe to the show on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher Radio, Audioboom, or many other podcast platforms so shows are delivered directly to your mobile device. Please give the show a 5-star rating and always support the sponsors who support the show. We'll be back soon for the best hour of Cardinals talk on the web. Rise up Red Sea, be Red Sea Red, and of course, Rise Up Sea Red.
Roll!